Buddy. Okay. So I believe we have a quorum, and thank you all for being willing to go back to Zoom. This is the story of the pandemic, is how we are becoming so flexible, right? I'd like to go ahead then and call the meeting to order. This is the Board of Trustees City Employee Pension Fund Board special meeting for February 1st, 2022. Welcome. And first we have the minutes of November 2nd, 2021 to approve. And so I'll entertain a motion and a second, and then we'll discuss. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Thank you, Mr. Maxey. I'm sorry, who did I hear? Was that you, Councilmember Baxter? Okay, thank you. All right, now, these were in your packet. Is there any discussion, any changes or corrections? No? All right, now the way we'll vote on Zoom, just to remind all the members, council members know this, we'll show a vote by hand so that we see your face and your hand vote. So all those in favor of approval, please raise your hand. All right, is anyone opposed? Okay, that motion passes. And next, for your information, we have the second quarter expenses, and that is in your packet. And I'll ask if there are any questions about it. I think this would be Aaron, Commissioner Hensley. Would this be questions for you if there are any?
And Susan as well, if there's any questions, but it's pretty standard, so I don't know if there's anything, anything exciting to report.
Does anyone have a question? All right, then we do need a motion for item 3, which is ratification of the transfer letter, which is page 8 of your packet. And so if I could have a motion to approve that and a second, and we'll discuss it.
Motion to approve.
Thank you.
The ratification.
Is there a second? Gay, thank you. Ms. Lang. Are there any questions? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Is anyone opposed? All right, that motion passes. And next on our agenda is the investment review from PFM. And let's see, who do we have? David, are you going to give that? Welcome.
I will be, yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
The floor is yours.
Okay, I should be showing the presentation on the screen. And you should have also received a PDF copy from me, as well as another copy. Both are the same, and those should be in your files. So in regards to the fourth quarter, so the period from October to December, the return-seeking portfolio generated a total return of 4.51%. This is unannualized, a periodic total return number, and that was significantly ahead of the benchmark by 43 basis points. Part of the reason why of the overperformance is because we've had a slight tilt towards equities versus bonds. And as you will see in the upcoming pages, bond portfolios have not performed very well because of the transitory state of the Federal Reserve, from a very accommodative monetary policy to an environment where they're anticipated to raise rates quite significantly in 2022. The liability defeasing portfolio, in total, there was about $228,000 in disbursements to beneficiaries, with the total return being slightly negative at negative 11 basis points. During the fourth quarter, there were a couple tactical changes to the portfolio in terms of we increased our slight overweight to equities by reducing the allocation to convertible bonds and preferred stocks. And then in December, we replaced our passive emerging market ETF with an active management strategy, the MFS Emerging Markets Debt Portfolio. Overall, in aggregate, the City Employee Pension Fund has $37.7 million. It's divided up into $28 million for the return-seeking portfolio. That's the excess, basically the liability defeasing portfolio of $9.7 million is expected to cover all of the pensioners' benefits based upon actuary assumptions. So in terms of there is definitely the liability defeasing portfolio as well as the fixed income portfolio making up about 48% of the overall City Employee Pension Fund. It's a very conservative position, but as we've talked about on previous calls, we want to make sure that we make sure all the benefits for the pensioners are fully protected and that there's no concerns, even with some of the gyrations in the market that we experienced over the last several weeks in January. In fact, it was one of the worst Januaries that we've seen in the market with the NASDAQ posting a negative 12% return. So over the last 12 months, the return-seeking portfolio has done quite well. It increased in market value by $3.2 million with a total return of 13.2%. Compared to the benchmark return of 10.8%. The liability defeasing portfolio had disbursements just shy of under $1 million at $950,000 and $927. So in regards to the economic conditions, COVID cases continue to be a concern, just like why we're having this meeting over a Zoom call. Omicron has been much more spreading in terms of, I know it's like lots of family friends that were able to escape the earlier versions as well as the Delta versions, but Omicron hit families, including my own. We've been very careful, but my youngest daughter picked it up from elementary school and then spread it to both of my other daughter and my wife. The overall U.S. economy is characterized by rapidly increasing inflation, improved labor market conditions, as well as depressed consumer confidence. And as I've already talked about, the Federal Reserve is reducing its monetary policy accommodation because of the strength in the economy. Some of the highlights, GDP during 2021 was extraordinary in terms of after a sluggish 2020 because of the pandemic and the economy decreasing by 3.4%, the actual numbers that were just reported last week show the economy growing by 5.7% real GDP. That is reflective of inflation. But one of the biggest concerns right now is inflation. Consumer prices are increasing at extremely rapid rates. The rate of inflation is the highest since the early 80s. So we're talking about 40 years ago. For Social Security recipients, their cost of living increase was 5.9%. We haven't seen that for a long time. But to offset that, Medicare premiums is sort of reflective of some of these inflationary concerns. Medicare premium deduction increased by 14.5%. So if you were getting benefits less than about $1,000, the 5.9% just essentially offset the sharp increase in Medicare premium deductions. It's actually impacting all sectors in terms of where, as you can see in the different colors, it's like we're not looking at just services and goods, but also food and energy as well. So you're probably seeing prices, regardless of what basket of goods you're buying, increase. One area that we continue to see is just striking is used cars. If you're looking to buy a car these days, it's almost nearly impossible. The new lots don't have any inventory on the lots, and if you're looking to buy a used car, those prices have gone up about 40% year over year. compared to the same car from previously. One of the challenges that we're going to be facing in the economy is that the unemployment rate is spectacular. In terms of pre-pandemic, so February of 2020, the unemployment rate was 3.6%. The current unemployment rate today is 3.9%. So just a few ticks higher than it was in February of 2020. But there's a big and significant difference in terms of there's about 4 million less jobs than there were previously pre-pandemic. So there's a lot of individuals that may have resigned and started an early retirement after the pandemic, as well as maybe people are reluctant to go into the workforce. I know our schools here haven't been going to virtual formats quite frequently, but in other areas where there are more frequent virtual conversions, you have to have one parent that's extremely flexible with a job that could call in with very limited notice in order to teach their young children. So the labor participation rate is actually slightly down from 82.9% to 81.9%. And the number of job openings that are being posted on job sites as well as help wanted ads is actually much higher than it was back in February of 2020. 6.8 million in 2020, and now it's 10.6 million. So overall, the unemployment picture looks terrific from a job seeker perspective. If you're looking for a new job, there's probably going to be multiple ones available for you. But if you are an employer, it's difficult to attract labor, and that's increasing prices for labor because you have to pay more than your competitor in order to secure that talent. After almost 2 years of the Federal Reserve lowering rates down to 0 to 25 basis points, we're going to see a shift in paradigm. And we're going to probably see that shift as early as the March meeting, where the Federal Reserve is expected to raise rates. This has already translated to higher rates on car loans as well as mortgages, because the Federal Reserve is expected to raise rates at least 3 times in 2022. That would mean that rates would be in the 75 basis point range. However, some big economists at JP Morgan as well as Citigroup expect that the Federal Reserve may be even more aggressive and raise rates anywhere between 4 or 5 times this year. It's going to be a wait and see in terms of what is the Federal Reserve's response, but there are a lot of dynamic changes right now in the economy. Not only are they going to be reducing monetary policy stimulus with a low federal funds target rate, but there's also been fiscal stimulus. For those with children, the last child care credit advance payment occurred in December, and parents no longer are receiving that in January and February. So equity markets posted tremendous returns for 2021. Here are the returns for domestic equities as well as international equities. The S&P 500, the 2021 returns was 28.7%. This was broad-based in terms of large caps, such as measured by the Russell 1000, posted equally strong returns. Really, the smaller cap stocks represented by the Russell 2000 actually showed slower gains with only about 14.8% return. Here in the U.S. did much better than overseas. As you can see, S&P was up 28%, but the international equities was only up 7.8%, and the emerging market actually posted a negative return, partly due to economies such as China, where there's basically cracking down and making their economies slightly tighter. Of course, one of the themes that we were concerned about was that, okay, there's going to be higher interest rates meaning that there's going to be depressed prices for fixed income assets. So you could see fixed income indices such as the Barclays Aggregate as well as the Global Aggregate posted negative returns for 2021. This was sort of expected and anticipated, and that was the reason why we had to tilt towards equities. We felt more comfortable that equities would do better than fixed income. We had no idea that they were going to be posting 20+% returns for the year, however. So other things and just themes, we still feel pretty confident and comfortable with U.S. equities, so that tilt remains so. International equities, even though there's been great efforts here in the U.S. in order to basically open up the economy from the COVID pandemic, Europe still is much more locked down than in the United States. We still lag in terms of testing, as well as some of our other preventative measures. But all this means that there's going to be a greater push on buying goods and services here in the United States compared to internationally, because we have lesser and less restrictive restraints because of COVID pandemic. We think that there's going to continue to be headwinds for the fixed income market. As I've already alluded to, the Federal Reserve is going to aggressively raise rates in 2022 and 2023. That's going to keep bond prices, especially longer duration bonds indices, sort of depressed. And then we see some attractiveness in alternatives such as real estate, private debt, which is part of those other assets that are represented on that pie chart earlier on that we talked about. So overall for 2022, yes, we saw some volatility in January, but the underlying economic conditions still remain quite favorable for equities. In terms of consumer spending is quite strong. Inflation is a concern that the Federal Reserve is going to have to battle. There's going to be maybe some increased margin compressions because people and companies are going to have to pay more for labor as well as prices. But this all helps in terms of pushing up the wage of living here in the United States. And then on the following page,
excuse me for interrupting. I thought maybe before we go to the return seeking, I'd see if there are any questions on this first part.
Thank you.
From board members. Are there any questions? We can always come back if you think of a question. All right. Go ahead then.
Sure. And there's just recaps later on here in the deck, slides 24, 25, and 26. This shows the performance of the various individual managers. At the end of the day, you're hiring PFM in order to monitor each of the individual managers. So what we would have you take a look at is, okay, how well are we basically moving the funds around between managers and making sure we choose managers that outperform the index. And as you can see, the 1-year, 2-year, and 3-year returns are ahead of the benchmark by what we would consider a substantial margin in terms of getting 200 basis points of additional return when the markets are supposed to be efficient. I think demonstrates how we're closely monitoring, managing the portfolio for you in order to select the best breed individual managers. So that covers what I think we generally cover during these meetings. If there's any questions.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you expect when the Feds, I think in March, when they announce the increase in interest rates, do you think they'll indicate anything about how many times they do expect to do this year? Or do you have a sense for that?
It continues to be a sort of a change in terms of every quarter. So December, March, June, and September, the board members actually put a forecast of what they think the federal funds target rate ought to be at the end of each calendar year. So this particular chart was released in the middle part of December of 2021. And just even shortly thereafter, we saw more inflation numbers that were much hotter than expected. So in terms of that 6.8% inflation number. So this is already a little stale. The market thinks that the Federal Reserve might have to be more aggressive in order to try to combat inflation. So to your point, they sort of tip their hands, and that's part of the reason why JP Morgan and other economists think that they might raise rates upwards to 5 times this year, because speeches that they're providing, just little hints here and there. If you recall last Wednesday, Jerome Powell had a meeting. They released their prepared remarks. And then in order to increase transparency, at 2:30, Jerome Powell actually answers direct questions from reporters. And if you look at the stock market from 2 o'clock to 2:30, we saw about a 3% decrease in the market as Jerome Powell continued to talk. And that was because how he was answering the questions sort of suggested that there may be more increases on the table than what the prepared remarks actually said. So anything's on the table. We're kind of thinking that the baseline is 3 increases with the outlier that's like, okay, it could be upwards of 5 increases. That would be extraordinary tightening. And I somewhat see it's like we still are constrained by the pandemic in terms of we're seeing higher prices for cars, for example, because there are no cars to buy. And as soon as we are able to have more microchips so that the factories can actually build the cars, like that's going to ease pressure on used car prices. And we're not going to see a year-over-year increase. They might see a decrease. But this is a very dynamic market, and I wouldn't want to place my eggs in any one basket because it's most likely going to be wrong. So.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there questions, board members? I don't see any hands up. So thank you very much, Mr. Calvert. We appreciate that. And next we have our actuarial report. And so we will move right on to that. And who is doing that? Do we have anyone who's going to present that?
I think it's just included for informational purposes, Mayor.
Okie doke.
That's right.
Well, it's in it was sent to you. I think this is the one that was, yeah, it was sent with your packet. So are there any concerns about it that you want to bring up right now, members? Councilmember Lamb.
I don't have any concerns, but I just wanted to, for the purpose of the minutes, to denote that how many times do you ever get to experience and sit on a board that has an excess of 500% funded pension? So, you know, that seems like a remarkable opportunity that we're all getting to have, which is pretty amazing. I think even looking for the page here, but I think it was 592. Yeah, 592% funded as of July 1 of 2021, which increased from 467% in July of 2020. So it's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool for the moment, right?
Well, it is.
As we know, it can change any moment.
Well, that's true. That's true. But I mean, you know, I think that it's a monumentous, and I always say attribute the board members of the past and the administrations of the past for their management of this, of these monies, and applaud each and every one of them. So
yes, thank you for that comment. You know, I got excited. This makes me think of the police and fire pension. Got excited when it went over $1 billion, and then the next meeting it was below $1 billion. So anything else, any other comments before we move to item number 6? All right, thank you for that, Councilmember Lamb. Item number 6 is a review of the historical changes to the pension fund. And so you will recall that our board passed some changes to the legislation to take to the state legislature. And you may remember during the meeting, I asked, what is the history of this and why did we do this pension as we did? And I didn't get an answer. So what we do know is that lots of people watch this meeting. And so Lieutenant Kennard contacted me immediately and shared with me what he knows to be some of the history. And so before, what I told him is I would invite him to this meeting to share the history with those who aren't familiar with it before we take this legislation on to the legislature. And I think it's important for everyone to hear the perspective he has. I was not here and so didn't know this, all this history. And so I've invited him to give you a brief synopsis of what happened and why the city employee pension fund, when it's closed finally, is supposed to go into the police and fire pension fund. So with that, welcome, Lieutenant Kennard. And
thank you, Mayor.
He also sits on our police and fire pension board.
Thank you, Mayor, for inviting me. I really appreciate your time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to hit real briefly on the history of the police and fire pension fund and going back to pension reform because it factors into to why the changes ended up being made to the city pension fund. As you all are aware, we do have a pretty significant unfunded liability on the police and fire pension fund. And a lot of that is due to some poorly written state statutes related to the pension fund, as well as some underfunding issues that happened in the past. Basically, with the way that the statute was written at that time, all that had to be paid back into the fund to help pay down any of the unfunded liability was the interest that unfunded liability was accruing every year on an annual basis. So that would end up equating to basically going and buying a house with an interest-only mortgage and only ever making the interest-only payments every single year on it. So that at the end of 30 years, you still owe that principal amount and you've never paid anything down on it. You had only paid the interest on it. So because of that, we weren't making any headway on paying down that unfunded liability. And that's when Mayor Gray put together the pension task force back in 2012. We had several meetings. I know Mayor Gorton was on that reform task force at that time. We had several meetings. We were coming up with some ideas, but we also realized that really to get stuff done, we needed to sit down with the FOP, the IAFF, the mayor's office, finance, and really hash out some of these details a bit more quickly and together to try to come up with a plan. So we met for several months with the mayor's office. We hired PFM to come in and consult with us on developing a plan. And as a result of that, we were able to develop a 30-year plan to pay down the unfunded liability. And as part of that agreement, police and fire employees agreed to contribute an additional 1%, as well as we agreed to a reduction in the guaranteed cost of living adjustments that people would get annually. And we ended up putting those on a scale that the COLA that you would receive ended up being based upon your income level. And that right there was one of the single biggest things that actually could knock down the unfunded liability quicker. So that ended up passing in 2013. And then several years later, the city was made aware of some legislation that CAECO and the League of Cities had been working on regarding pension funds, old city pension funds across the state. They had been approached by several other municipalities and counties and cities that had these funds that all the beneficiaries were passing away, and they had no way to close those funds out. They were going to be left with having to pay administrative fees to fund managers, but they did not have a way to liquidate those assets because it was covered by state law with what they could do. So what they did was they got together with CAECO and the League of Cities to create legislation that would allow them a way to liquidate those funds. The mayor's office approached police and fire and said they wanted to get on board with that legislation that was going through. And there were then discussions about, the thoughts of police and fire related to that, particularly since just a few years prior to that, we had gone through the pension reform process. So as a result of that, those discussions, the city acknowledged the fact that they had money in this city pension fund that had been designated as money to be used towards pension benefits. And that once those beneficiaries passed away, that money, since it had previously been set aside for pension, it would make sense to transfer those funds over to the police and fire pension in order to help pay down that unfunded liability more quickly. We recognize the fact that that pension legislation typically does not go forward and get passed unless we're all on the same page. And so that ended up being agreement between the city and police and fire at that time that, hey, the police and fire won't oppose the legislation if the city's on board with making that deal to transfer those funds in to have those assets help pay down that unfunded liability. So we can get that paid off quicker. So again, as the mayor mentioned, I, along with some other people, have been following these meetings for the last couple years now. And that's why I reached out to the mayor, because it just appeared to me that I noticed that some of the comments that were being made, there was, I want to say there was nothing nefarious done by police or fire to try to get this done a certain way. It was out of the fact of the sacrifice that our police officers and firefighters increased their contributions to try to help pay down the unfunded liability, as well as agreeing to that reduction in that COLA. So it was trying to help make this right. And if there was a way to chip away at that 30 years, then that's, that this was a good way to do it, as opposed to those dollars maybe getting spent on something else. Because over the long term, if this liability, just like you all understand with any loan, if you don't pay it off, you're going to continue to pay interest and stuff on it, and it's going to cost you longer, or cost you more over the long run. So I wanted the mayor to be aware that, again, that this was kind of a deal that went hand in hand with police and fire and the city to make those changes a few years ago, and that turning around now and pushing through this legislation would kind of be walking back what that deal was that was struck back then. So
Thank you, Lieutenant Kennard. And before we go to questions, if people have questions, do you remember what year that agreement between police and fire and the city was? Do you have any
whatever.
recollection?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact year. It was whichever year that this legislation was changed. That's the year that it happened.
The KCO legislation that was brought forward.
Yes, ma'am.
So somewhere in my mind, I'm thinking 2016, but that may not, I
I
don't
was
know that
thinking
that's
16 or
correct.
17, somewhere in that area. Mhm.
I'm sure we could find out. And I'll just ask one more question before we go forward. Do you know if this was ever, I think our pension task force was finished. So this never came to the task force. Do you know if it ever came to this city employee pension fund board?
I can't speak to whether or not it was.
Okay, I was just curious.
Mhm.
Okay, so board members, this is an opportunity. I know Lieutenant Kennard may not know all the answers, but if you have questions that you want to ask, because as you recall, the legislation that this board supported to go to the current legislature asks for a change, asks for the pension funds not to go to the police and fire pension fund. So we need to have some good, healthy discussion about this. Councilmember Kloiber.
Thank you, Mayor. I think the change we asked is that it still goes to the fire and pension, to fire and police pension. It's just that it's now counted as a contribution from the city to that pension. If I'm clear, I believe that was the change. It still was going to the same place. It just would now be counting as a contribution, whereas originally it wasn't. So I think it still holds to the intention that we just brought to our attention of, that it would be going towards that pension shortfall, just that it would also count as the contribution from the city as opposed to.
Yes, that's correct. It would not do what Lieutenant Kennard has suggested that the intent of that past legislation was, which is lower the unfunded liability, correct? This is the whole point of him coming to us, is it would relieve the city of a pension payment. It would do nothing to take that chunk of money and lower the unfunded liability. Is that, Lieutenant Kennard, am I reflecting what you were saying?
Yes, Mayor. Thank you. That is correct. What it would do, the intention of the deal struck at that time was to pay down that unfunded liability. Whereas by passing the legislation as you all proposed it, that would allow the city to save money elsewhere in the budget, just apply these dollars to it that year. And in essence, it actually kind of kicks the can down the road, because if you're just making that, if you're using it for that annual contribution that year, you're not actually paying down a significant portion of that unfunded liability, which in essence you can equate to interest, so that it would then take longer to pay down that unfunded liability by doing that lump sum payment by doing it as an annual payment as opposed to a lump sum payment towards the unfunded liability.
On the surface, it's a subtle difference, right? It's when you dig into the detail of it that which is the Lieutenant Kennard's point. Go ahead, Councilmember Kloiber. Did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of follow up with the thought there. I appreciate the intention from Lieutenant Kennard's point of view, but as best from our records, it wasn't really brought to this entity's discretion to talk about this, to make this kind of a deal. And also the previous deal, which he's referring to as this being kind of recompense for, had already been established and done. Like that deal had been negotiated and put in place. So this was kind of tacked on afterwards in order to help with that unfunded. Is there another benefit to the city to help pay this unfunded thing? Would it be more beneficial to the city to pay this unfunded versus not? I guess would be my question. And I know you're talking about paying it off down the line or kicking the can, but I don't know whose responsibility that kicking the can falls on, whether it's the city's responsibility to pay that, or where does that fall?
I might,
So, yeah, that's a fair question, council member. So there's no additional funds from police and fire going in towards the police and fire pension fund. We pay 12%. That's it. So any additional costs that end up occurring, basically the city is on the hook for it. So ultimately what you're looking at is, at what point in time is the city going to be able to reduce those costs, and in what ways can the city reduce those costs? Right now, if with pension contributions on the city side being about 39%, or being in the high 30s, if that unfunded liability, if you had a significant chunk of money paid towards that unfunded liability, that would reduce that percentage that the city has to put in for their contribution. They've got the annual required contribution, which is fairly small, but then you've got this basically interest component for the unfunded liability, which is rather large on top of it. So again, by paying that down with a lump sum, that significantly reduces it and gets the city to where all they have to pay is the ARC sooner.
Commissioner Hensley, would you like to weigh in a little bit on this? Because I know we've had conversations about this.
Sure. Actually, I pulled up the actuarial valuation for the police and fire pension fund, and the unfunded liability as of that last report was $223 million. The fund is 79, just under 80% funded at this point in time. So based on our current valuation from PFM, it looks like the return seeking portfolio, if today was the cutoff, that number would be about $28 million against that $223 million unfunded liability. That represents almost an additional year's worth of payments for the city. So our typical contribution is around $30 million to the police and fire pension fund. So that would add acceleration of approximately a year. Given that all of these things are invested in our market valuation goes up and down. So our unfunded liability will change based on our valuation in the market, and it's done really well this year. So I think I had actually talked about this issue with Lieutenant Kennard, and then it was in the early days of this position and it just completely flew out of my mind. We discussed it, and I should have brought it at that time. So I'm really glad that he reached out to the mayor again and brought that forward, because I am also lacking in history. But as far as what that contribution would do, it represents roughly another year's worth of remittances from the city to the fund.
Okay, thank you. If you don't mind, Councilmember Kloiber, we'll go to Councilmember Lamb, then we'll come back to you.
Thanks, Mayor, and thank you, Lieutenant Kennard, for bringing this history forward. Obviously, I've been on this board ever since I came back to the city and was in the elected capacity, and I never knew any of this history. So I really value and appreciate your willingness to come forward and to let us know, because it's very important that we understand the background of it. And I think it's interesting that KCO and KLC brought forward. I know that there has been a lot of involvement on the state level involving the other pensions, state funded and KERS, CERS, so, there's a lot of pension discussions going around the state as it is right now, just because of all of the issues addressed. So I appreciate understanding that you added 1% for the police and fire pension members, that they're paying an additional 1% to their payments toward the pension. And I'm thinking about how that they have navigated on a state level with the KERS and CERS, where they have added additional responsibility to the entities, the municipalities that are having to pay into those. So I see all of the relevance of this. And I guess the only one thing I will say, and this is no offense to anybody, but it really frustrates me that this was never brought forward to the City Employee Pension Fund Board. If there was one thing that I could turn back the clock and say that it should have been, that discussion should have been brought forward to this board at that time to involve the conversation, and whether it was just here's what we're going to do. And I mean, but of all the things that I would be frustrated most about, and is that never happened. And that's why I so appreciate this conversation today, because, and Commissioner Hensley, I appreciate understanding about the 223 million unfunded amount, that it's 79 to 80%. And is that the July 2021 that you're talking about, the 79 to 80% funded? You said you were looking at it is, okay, alrighty. And also that the 30 million per year pension payment from the city. So based on the 30 million a year, how many years? And I know I've got it in this one other a document that we received last week when we were talking about budgets. How many years out are we talking about this 30 million a year payment? And I don't know whether that should be Commissioner Hensley or.
Well, as Lieutenant Kennard mentioned, the rate for the officers, the police officers and the firefighters is set at 12%. And so based on where the actuarial comes back with what our contributions need to be, the city has to make up the difference. So that rate actually changes year over year, roughly based on our authorized strength. That's about where we fall as far as our contributions recently. That rate is going down slightly next year. I have a feeling it will turn right back around and go back up the year after that. But I do think that, that's just a ballpark. That's just to give a good idea of where we are based on our authorized strength and where we've been in recent history as far as our responsibility and our contribution rate. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does, but I mean, the additional pension payment that is above and beyond what we pay in per pension member, and once you meet and exceed that unfunded amount of 223 million, then the pension dollars go back to some normalcy. Is that fair to say?
Well, and it sounds like and Lieutenant Kennard may know better than me, but it sounds like pension reform was in the early, 2010, 12, 13. And if it was a 30-year, we've got a ways to go. So I don't know if you know right off the top of your head, Lieutenant.
I will say this, this actuarial study that we just received for this past year, again, the market performance was absolutely phenomenal. If you compare that to the previous year, we still had about 23 years remaining on payments. This last year, because of market returns being excessive, it dropped it down to it could be paid off in 9. However, I don't anticipate us to continue to have, that a market that would support that. A drop in the market, it could turn around next year and go back to, we've got 21, 22 years left. So that's again where it fluctuates back and forth.
Sure. Well, again, I appreciate this. I appreciate this information. It makes what was not known definitely publicly known, and I appreciate that it's part of our record now. And again, thank you, Lieutenant Kennard, for your time today. I greatly appreciate it, sir. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
You're welcome. And I also share your frustration. I did not know this. I don't think anyone on this board, as I look around, knew this. And so, but we need to know it. And so that's why I asked Lieutenant Kennard to be here. Does anyone have questions before we go back to Councilmember Kloiber? Anyone who hasn't spoken? All right, Councilmember Kloiber.
Thank you, Mayor. So with this looming liability, we'll call it, the city will have to figure out a way to handle it at some point in time. The way things are now, if everything went as it is now, the pension would roll over into that and it would be set to take care of that liability in that one chunk. What we've proposed to put out there actually creates flexibility, because by putting it into the fund as a contribution, we've freed up the funds in the government budget, so we can pay that down if we see that it is the time to do so at that point in time. So I really do think that what we have proposed here, keeps in spirit with helping us to manage our budgets, but gives us the flexibility to do it appropriately at the time, depending on how the markets are, how everything is moving around. Again, there's a lot of volatility. I just would prefer to have the option that gives us more flexibility, as opposed to the one where it is only applied towards that debt, as opposed to being able to be manipulated in some way in order to make sure that we make the best use of our funds once this pension has served its purpose. So that would be my reason, given everything that Lieutenant Kennard has said and everything we've discussed today. Understanding we have this looming liability, we don't know when this pension is going to fall off, and hopefully it's not for a long time, right? We're not hoping this happens tomorrow. So when that does happen, I would like to be able to evaluate how things look in that moment and have the flexibility to say, okay, cool, this is going as a contribution for the city towards the pension, so it's still going where it's needed. If we then have the funds freed up to give the additional, pay down our looming debt as it was described, then we can do that on that timetable based off where we're at that point. So I appreciate hearing all the history. I feel like what we have going forward is still going to be very helpful in accomplishing all the goals, but allows us to have the flexibility based off where the markets are at and where the city financials are at in order to handle this whole thing in time. So that's my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Do you have any comment to that, Lieutenant Kennard?
I do. One of my concerns, Councilman Kloiber, is that again, I think we all have a pretty good understanding of how interest works on things. And I think that being able to substitute those funds as opposed to paying down what's in essence an interest payment. Anybody that owns a house is interested in paying off that home as quickly as they can. And we all know that the best way to do that is by paying down that principal, which in essence, this unfunded liability is a big portion of that principal. So by using that chunk of money to pay that down will help the city in the long term pay that off quicker, as opposed to what I believe is maybe a more short-sighted view of using those funds to shore up, some city budgeting at a time, just as able to do that just on that 1 year. Well, I know Commissioner Hensley pointed out that, it's based upon current numbers. What's in there would be the equivalent of knocking down 1 year. Again, it actually, the impact of that would be larger than that, because as you've paid down more of that unfunded liability, you have less of that unfunded liability that you have to pay in the future, which then is going to, on an annual basis, decrease the amount of money that the city is having to put towards that. So, it's a concept that I don't want to be lost, that I want you all to understand. And again, going back to something that Councilmember Lamb struck on, the fact why the city did not bring this to you all and the board at that time, I don't know. I know based upon conversations I had with the mayor at that point in time, they viewed this as this was a fund that was set up to pay those specific benefits, and that no additional benefits were promised above that. And I know, my own personal feeling is that the funds, I know you all had some discussions about maybe passing along some of those funds, and I was very happy to see, because I think the people are very deserving in some of those cost of living adjustments that you all have given them. But I know at the time with Mayor Gray, with conversations that we had, he had a little different view. So so I don't know why it was not brought to you all at that point in time, other than to say, I think that the mayor's office position was, once the fund was done, it wasn't really necessarily up to that board to make that determination on how that would get used, because it was in essence dollars that the city had allocated, that the city should be able to determine how to utilize those. And I think that's, again, I can't speak for them. There's nobody here for them to say anything, but I think that's why they were willing to sit down and strike the deal that they did at that point in time.
Thank you. Councilmember Lamb, would you take over the chair a moment? I'd like to speak.
Absolutely, yes. And I'll recognize Mayor Gordon.
Thank you. So a couple of things. I want to go back to what Lieutenant Kennard said in the very beginning. And this is a subtlety, but the legislature is in session, and the legislature can pass a bill or they cannot pass a bill. We all know that.
Mhm.
And Lieutenant Kennard, this will not be a direct quote, but you can tell me if I'm off base, said, it will be better to go forward together with legislation. Now, those of us who've been around a long time understand what that means, right? We have a much better shot at getting this legislation passed if we go together. Secondly, in our conversation, when he came to me with all this, which had happened under the last administration that we didn't understand or know about, I said to him, what if we could come up with a compromise to go forward? And I don't know exactly what it would be at this moment, but what I was thinking was something like part of what is remaining in this pension would go toward a pension payment, and part would go to pay down the unfunded liability. To me, that would be best of both worlds. And may I say your response, Lieutenant Kennard?
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
He said they would be open to that. So, this is a situation where I think that we want to do what's best for the city, the big city, which includes a lot of different moving parts. If we could come up with a compromise, I believe we would have a better shot at having this passed in the legislature, just to put a fine point on it. I don't want to go forward with this current change in the legislation, knowing there's a great risk it may not get passed. So with that, I'll
Mayor, I'll turn it back over to
Yes.
you.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I think we have some hard decisions to make. Councilmember Kleber, you've spoken a couple times. Is there anyone else who has thoughts or opinions who hasn't spoken? There we go, Director Maxwell.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
I think, you know, given that there is quite a bit of, not speculation, but some things that are being said here that, you know, that this was made, you know, the deal was struck back in 2012 and 13, but this was brought up in 16. It seems to me that this would be ripe for some kind of compromise. That some would go toward decreasing the liability, and some would just go toward the payment. That seems like a reasonable approach to me, from what I've heard. I don't know the percentage or whatnot, but it seems like what you said, Mayor, and what you said, Larry, Lieutenant Kennard, makes sense to me. You know, in terms of going forward together. So I'd be definitely interested in supporting something like that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet, and then we'll go back to our council members, two of our council members. Okay, Councilmember Kloiber and then Councilmember Lamb.
Thank you, Mayor. So I am all for trying to find compromise. You know, obviously, if we were talking about these funds not going to the pension plan at all, right, then this proposal we have out there would be considered a very big compromise for that contribution. But more specifically, I want to kind of address this paying down your home loan analogy, because I think that's something we can all understand. And it can be a little simplistic and sometimes overly simplistic. In 2007, when the markets crashed, if you had money that had just been in the market that was hugely depreciated, you wouldn't want to be using those assets at that point to try and pay down as much of your home loan as you wanted to, because ostensibly the markets would rebound and they'd be worth more if you left them in. That was always the hardship people were faced with the retirement funds, where they were saying, well, I have to take this money to live off of, right? So when I talk about flexibility and trying to make sure that we can do what's best for the city overall, not every point in time is going to be the best opportunity to pay down your debt. Sometimes the markets are not great for doing that, where, you know, right now the markets are amazing, right? We've had huge returns in the last year. So that's a good time to go pay down some of your debt, but that's not always the case. But all that being said, I'm just a proponent of trying to get as much flexibility into these funds as possible to make sure the city can make the best decisions for the overall picture based on the conditions that we don't know what they're going to be. If we're talking about some kind of compromise, I would like to make sure we have some of that component in it, because I think it's very important for us to make a decision that doesn't lock us into a course of action that could be the worst course of action at that point in time, given the market conditions we face. So I'm here to have any conversation people want to have, but I just wanted to make sure we all understood that, you know, it's not always the right time to pay down your debt on your house, given what else is going on in the world.
Thank you, Councilmember Lamb.
Thank you, Mayor. And again, I really appreciate this conversation, because again, I'm all about wanting to talk about things so we better understand. So I do, of course, I have been a compromise gal ever since I've been back on council. So I agree that there is always benefit from that. And I guess what I would like to understand, and I don't know if anybody has the answer to this, but at the point, obviously we will know when the last member it passes. And so at that point, we will know that something takes place at that point. And what I would like to know legally, and I don't know if it's based on what was passed and at the state level, as to how that, if it's just an automatic rollover, that the whatever is left in this pension, does it automatically just go straight to the police and fire pension system? Or is there something that has to take place within this body, this board, who has managed these funds for however many years? Is there an opportunity for more transparency? I'm not saying to change anything, but is there an opportunity? And I guess I would ask our Mr. Cravens and Law Department, do you know if there is an opportunity for a discussion at this board level before those funds go straight over to police and fire pension?
Welcome, Mr. Cravens.
Morning. The way
Morning.
that the statute is written and the way I think it would work would be once all liabilities have been satisfied, which means there's no remaining beneficiaries of this fund, an ordinance would have to be passed by the council to basically repeal this pension. The authorizing legislation would have to be repealed. At that point, I think the way the statute reads is the fund's board of trustees shall, within 60 days, proceed with liquidation of the residual assets of the fund. And so the way that right now that section is written, the residual assets would be directed or distributed by this board to the general fund, but they'd be earmarked for then further disbursement to the police and fire retirement fund. So that's the way it's written right now.
Okay.
And it would be treated, and the way that the statute is written by now, just to be very clear, is it would be characterized as a purely supplemental contribution, which means you can't be offset any other required contribution that the city would have to make pursuant to other pension obligations. It would truly be extra money and extra distribution to the police and fire fund. That's, I think, the way this would work.
Well, I think that is very helpful to understand the process as it was approached in the KRS, the new bill. So that to me tells me that taking the opportunity to have this conversation at that point doesn't matter whether we have it today or next year or at the time that this pension is no longer needed. So having said that, then I think that it is the time to work out a compromise, whether it be this year or next year. Something I've always thought was interesting, and this is no offense to anybody, but we all work in our silos. Our city employees pension fund has worked in our silo, and police and fire, you work in yours, and then our CERS is in a separate silo. I think that wouldn't it be unique if we could all sit down at the same table and at some opportunities and share our experiences, and there could be some value in learning from that experience, I think, but I realize that that's hard to do, but perhaps there's an opportunity to have another discussion over this course of this next year to better understand what those numbers really do need to look like. And I'd love to be a part of that before I exit my seat. Because this is something that's been near and dear to my heart for many, 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 many years. I've actually been involved with this board since 1992. So you know my history with it, and I'm not trying to sound like one of my colleagues, but so I have gone a long way with this group of retirees, and so having said all of that, I think it's important to understand the process that we would have to move forward. I appreciate that this board would be involved. This board would actually have to put forward the ordinance that the council would consider, I assume, Mr. Cravens. Is that fair to say?
I think the way I would say it is this board would be the one that would basically be liquidating the residual assets.
Mm-hmm.
So once council then says, all liabilities have been satisfied and we're repealing the authorized legislation, then this board has a pot of money that it would have to take action on to liquidate. And the statute right now directs that the way this board would have to act would be to distribute that to the general fund to be used expressly as a supplemental contribution to the police and fire pension fund.
Okay. Well, that's helped me a lot. Now, I mean, I'd love to hear from some more of our board members, especially our retirees, to see what they think, but not to put you guys on the spot. But I do think that it's, I think there's an opportunity here for compromise and an opportunity for conversation, given the fact that we still have 41 members to this day and that we're not going to be making these decisions in the next year or two, I would pray. So that's my 2 cents worth. So thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And you did remind me of something I meant to say in the very beginning. We did explore and various people look through all kinds of records to see if there was any written record of a committee or a board or anyone who dealt with what Lieutenant Kennard has brought to us that happened previously, and we could find nothing. So to Lieutenant Kennard's point, this was an agreement made by some folks, and then it just went forward. So we did look for that information. Okay, anything else? We do have the motion, which was approved, to take our current legislation forward. So if there's no change to that, then we will be required to take it forward to this legislature. Councilmember Lamb.
Well, I'm going to make a motion that we consider recalling that motion, and that probably isn't the right language. I don't think we can rescind that, but I think that my motion needs to be that we restructure what our intent was and think about it, not having that decision today, and perhaps maybe have a conversation down the road this year, and as it relates to what opportunities are could be in a compromise. And I know that's a lot of words.
Are you, I need to understand
So do I.
what you're moving. So do the people who might second it. Are you saying you want to go forward with the legislation, or you want to delay going forward?
I want to delay.
That's the
going
first
forward.
question. Oh, okay.
I want to delay go forward, and I want us to have an opportunity to have conversation with, I know Lieutenant Kennard, you're on the police and fire pension board, but perhaps there's an opportunity to have a more in-depth conversation with the appropriate persons. And I don't know who that is. And Mayor, you chair, do you co-chair?
I chair it.
You chair the, so.
So are you looking for, I just need to understand, are you, when you say to have future conversations, are you, you've already said that your motion is to delay taking this forward. Are you saying to have future conversations about compromise or about different approach, or what?
Right. Okay. Right. I want to have future conversation about a compromise and what that needs to look like. I mean, we're not going to sit here today and be able to say that we should take 10 million and go toward the principal, and if there is 30 million, 20 million toward the unfunded, towards the payment, if that's, I don't think we're here ready today to make that. I'm not ready to make that kind of a decision. So my motion would be to clarify, and I'll go round and around here, is to retract, to change the change moving forward with our legislative request and to perhaps in 6 months at our next meeting in 6 months that we bring forward some options of compromise so that we can discuss them. That's my
Our
motion.
next meeting's in April.
What's
You
the one
said
after that,
6
July?
months And then April. Yes,
July.
July is the one after that.
I'd say let's let us get through the budget discussions and let's bring this back, and that gives everybody plenty of time to be able to look at options and bring it back in July of 2022.
Okay, is there a second to the motion? Does everybody understand the motion? Are there? Thank you for clarifying that. Is there a second? Councilmember Kloiber, are you seconding? Okay. Now let's have questions about the motion, which, as I understand, is two parts. The first is to delay taking the current legislative changes forward, and between now and July the 26th meeting, to have conversation to look at what a compromise could look like and bring it forward at the July 26th meeting. Is that okay? Now, so board members, if you'll let me know if you want to speak to the motion. Councilmember Kloiber.
Thank you, Mayor. I do want to remind everybody that what we had put forth to the legislature had multiple parts to it. One of them, and the first
Yeah.
reason we were sending anything out there, was so that we could get an amendment to how we are able to put people onto this specific committee. And I don't know how delaying that is going to affect it. I know we have had issues getting quorum in the past. And so I just want to know, and I guess I'll ask Councilmember Lamb if she wanted to bifurcate this and send that portion out and leave the other back for consideration, or if she wanted to have both of them delayed until July.
May I respond, Mayor?
Sure.
Yes, I was strictly talking about the item as it related to this pension, the change in the funds, and not the other part as it related to our makeup of our board. Thank you for that, Councilmember Kloiber.
Okay. I think that the only reason we had them all together was we thought that, and again, to the mayor's point earlier, when we're looking to try to see, we want to put things that'll be the most successful out there to the state. We thought that, bundling everything as one package would have the most chance of success going forward. So again, I didn't know if we wanted to stick with that or if it was just to take this one item out. Either way is fine. I just wanted to be clear.
That's a good question because, and I'll get Mr. Cravens to weigh in on this. I think that if you do bifurcate it, this board will need to come back and approve the legislation you're wanting to go forward now. So that we would need I think that you would need to approve that to go to the current legislature. Is that, Mr. Cravens, is that your take, or what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think right now the board has approved kind of a compound legislative amendment. So it depends on, it's what the will of the board is, but I'm more than happy to separate those out into a form that then you all could then act upon separately if that was the will of the board
Okay, and how
at the next
quickly?
meeting.
How quick? Well, the next meeting's after the legislature's finished, so we would need to have a special meeting, I would think.
Well, it will not be difficult to
Just
prepare, to separate out, because like Councilmember Kloiber said, it's just a two-part amendment, one of which basically gives the mayor the authority to appoint to fill vacancies that were otherwise unable to fill, and the other is this pension characterization. And so I would just be separating out just the one-part amendment to the mayor's appointment power for this board.
We could all
And
probably
I could
look
do
at
that
it.
quickly. I mean, I can turn
Yeah.
that around. this week.
Okay. Okay. All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? It would be good to hear from board members what you're thinking.
I think,
Councilmember Baxter.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Lamb, just for clarification purposes, are you proposing that at the July meeting, we would have, like, is your hope to have that joint conversation at that point? Or are you hoping to have joint conversations prior to that? And have all of the research before that July meeting so that in July we can make a decision? Is that, just so I understand?
May I respond, Mayor?
Sure.
Yes, I think that those conversations need to be had before the July meeting so that we can fully understand what's possible. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Good question. I think I heard, if you have a question, just raise your hand so I can understand. Charlene, I think I heard you trying to weigh
Yes.
in. Thank you.
thank you. I think that if we're going to do this, we need to move on it and not keep kicking it down the road. That seems to be what we do all the time, because every time something new comes up. So I think if this board wants to move ahead, we need to do it now, because as we know, time goes by and we had to really rush when we did that legislation. So I think we should go ahead and move on this as quickly as possible. The other thing I wanted to mention, and that was when Mr. Cravens talked about when this board ends, or when this pension fund ends because of all the members are deceased, won't that just be a council decision at that point? I mean, and not this board, because there'd be no employees to be members of it. I mean, it would be totally a council decision, correct?
Your point is there would be the members of the board may not even be able to have a quorum because the beneficiaries wouldn't be serving. Is that your point?
Yes, I'm just wondering if that would just automatically go before full council, since you may not have a quorum without any board member, without any employee members, or how would that work?
Mr. Cravens?
Well, the board is a board of trustees, and you're trustees of this fund. And so when the council repeals the authorizing legislation that authorizes this fund, whatever remains of the board would need to wind up the affairs of the board as trustees of the fund by basically just voting to, wind up, by basically voting to say the residual assets of the fund will now be distributed to the general fund to be used for the purpose of a contribution to the police and fire pension fund. And it would just be a simple matter of whatever remains of the board taking that vote, and then the board's done at that point.
It would be dissolved. And is it your opinion, based on Ms. Summers' question, that the board could act without a quorum?
Yes, for the purpose of winding up the affairs of the board and the residual assets of the trust, I think whatever's left, the board would then just dissolve after it winds up those residual assets.
Thank you. Did that answer your question?
Yes,
Ms.
ma'am.
Summers? Okay, thank you. Commissioner Hensley?
I was just going to note that I think that the final actions of the board may be to approve a last transfer, because we approve the transfer of funds in and out of these accounts. And so there would be a last transfer that was the resolution that completed all of this.
Thank you. All right, we still have the motion on the floor to delay the current legislative changes and bring compromise at the July 26th meeting. Other discussion about the motion? Councilmember Lamb?
Thank you, Mayor. And I guess this, from what Ms. Summers just was talking about, I think that even more so iterates to me that the importance of having this legislature changed to manage the appointments to this board sooner than later, because, I mean, again, I don't expect us to lose 41 members in the next year, but I just think that we really need to go ahead and get that information changed so that we have options for pointing to this board. I mean, I just feel like that's imperative. So that's why I'm separating it out. So thank you.
Technically, it's not separated out. So there will have to, if you want to do that, you'll have to amend the motion. At this time, the entire legislative change is being delayed according to your motion. So if you want to separate it, you'll need to make an amendment. And now would be the time. Councilmember Lamb.
Normally don't like talking this much, as my colleagues probably would take deference with me on that, but
Well, I think I've heard a lot of comments about separating it out. So
Yeah.
you know, it would make sense to amend the motion if that's the will of the board.
Well, and Councilmember Chloe, you were kind enough to second the motion, but I would like to separate it out. And I know that it means two different forms of legislation going to Frankfurt, but you know, we've had a large struggle with getting this board appointed in the last year, and I just don't want to see that going forward, if we can make a change now. So I would ask a friendly amendment to my motion to separate out the items specifically and go ahead and move forward with the change in the board appointment legislation that we were proposing.
So there's an amendment on the floor to separate out the appointment part. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Hensley. Now, discussion about the amendment. And I think Mr. Cravens has said he could pretty easily do that and bring it back to us in a week or two.
Well, there's that, or bear in mind, the board at its last meeting approved the language related to the amending of the veto power or the appointment power of the mayor. So you could maybe do the motion as to move forward on that section as approved at the November meeting of the City Employees Pension Fund. And that way the language that's already been approved would be the language you're moving forward on that part, if that makes sense.
So,
If you're comfortable doing that. I mean, like I said, I'm more than happy to separate out and recirculate it, but I think the board's already acted on both parts. And all we'd be doing now is basically saying, we're going to delay on the one half, but the changes to the membership and the mayor's appointment power as approved at the previous meeting will move forward given that previous action.
okay, do you want, Councilmember Lamb, you made that amendment. Do you want to change your amendment?
I don't know if you could stack them, but I guess, I mean, I do agree with Mr. Cravens exactly. And I probably should have thought through, I have not thought through a darn motion yet today. So.
Well, that way we don't have to come back.
I agree.
To approve another motion. And Commissioner Hensley, would you want to change your second?
Yes, ma'am.
So you both are amenable to that?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so the amendment would be to approve going forward the portion that has to do with appointments to the board and that. Okay, anyone want to comment on the amendment? I think we've thrashed through it enough, haven't we? I see no hands up, so all those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. Is anyone opposed? Okay, the amendment passes. So what we have on the floor is to delay the portion of the legislative changes that have to do with where the pension fund monies go when the beneficiaries, when the pension's closed, and then move forward with the appointment parts. So is there any further discussion? All right, all those in favor of approval, please raise your hand. Is anyone opposed? Okay, that motion passes. Very good. So I'll ask Mr. Cravens if you can go ahead though and separate them out for us so that you can maybe email that around. So
Yeah,
that
what
we
I will
can-
do is I will separate them out and I will just shoot an email to the board that shows here is the language that was approved at the previous meeting that you all basically reaffirmed that you
Yes.
want to move forward in this meeting.
Yes, and then I will go about working with our lobbyist to find the legislator, and this won't be difficult, to carry the parts that we want carried forward. And we can get it done in this current legislative session. All right. Lieutenant Kennard, thank you. And thank you all for allowing this all to be heard. It's been now it's on the public record, which is a good thing. So with that, I believe you have our meeting schedule on the agenda. And so our next meeting is April the 26th. And we will see at that time whether we'll be doing by Zoom or in person. And is there any other business for the good of the whole? Councilmember Lamb?
I guess one last question as far as who we have the conversation with about a compromise with the language. If there is an opportunity, Mayor and Lieutenant Kennard, since you all both sit on that board, that you come to us in April with who we need to have that conversation with, so that we can do that, please.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's kind of a loose end. If you, would you allow me to talk with Lieutenant Kennard and we can get a representation from this board and from the police and fire board, if that makes sense. And of course, we'll need Michael Cravens in there and probably Commissioner Hensley.
Yes, yes.
But if we can go forward that way. Does that suit everybody? All right, very good, thank you. Anything else for the good of the whole? Okay, could I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Summers. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Hensley. And all those in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you very much. We are adjourned. Everybody stay safe on the upcoming weather, and thank you so much.